We take travel in Alaska for granted today. Despite the vast distances, you can fly to just about anywhere in our state. But back then,
you could fly an hour or walk a week to get to where you wanted to go. And that's what revolutionized this state.
It's hard to imagine what Alaska would be like without some of its aviation pioneers.
The early pilots in Alaska, they were just almost as popular as God was.
Ahead, the airplanes and the pilots who flew them, how they changed Alaska.
Sponsorship for Frontiers with Rhonda McBride is provided by your local Alaska Toyota dealers. Toyota, let's go places. Alaska, where there are old triumphs, but also new frontiers. With challenges as great as the state itself, but a belief the best is yet to come. Bringing you the faces, the places, and the spirit of the last frontier. This is Frontiers with Rhonda McBride.
Welcome to our program as we look back at a time when airplanes opened up a big frontier in Alaska. Orrin Siebert understood their importance when his family moved to Pilot Point on the northern coast of the Alaskan Peninsula in Ugashik Bay. He was only 14. Today he's 80, and that love affair with aviation continues.
Welcome to Pan Air Alaska Airlines Partnership Flight 3298 with service to Unalaska Dutch Harbor.
Orrin Siebert founded Pan Air more than 6 decades ago. It's one of the oldest family-owned airlines in the United States. Today, his son Danny runs the business.
Flying is everything to me.
And Orrin spends as much time as he can on one of his passion projects, the Alaska Aviation Museum.
Actually, let's go next door and I'll show you.
And who better to tour the museum with than one of the pioneers of Alaska's aviation industry? It looks like a piece of junk.
It is. It definitely is. It isn't worth nothing.
But it does have the Ween name on it. Did it do anything special?
Just carried passengers and freight. One of only a few that were able to do it back in the 1920s. Here's a wooden float.
Orrin Siebert does have a tendency towards understatement, but never doubt his appreciation for the early aviators.
In Valdez, the airport limousine of 1934. Bob Reeve and Mudhole Smith, they shared this car.
But Bob Reeve wasn't willing to share much else.
Yep, that's Bob Reeve's handwriting.
The museum has the original shack, which served as Reeve's combination office and tool shed, with a warning to keep your hands off his tools.
Back in those days, of course, there was no parts store and there was no hardware store. So if you had a problem with your plane, you had to fix it yourself.
Reeve has a special place in Siebert's heart.
So Bob is the first guy that realized that the mud flats of Valdez, he could take off with his skis in the mud and then fly up into the mountain and land on the snow.
With few airports in Alaska, skis made air travel possible, and they evolved quickly to meet the need. I would imagine the wooden ones would be too heavy.
Exactly. All these airplanes, weight was everything. You had to keep it as light as possible.
Some skis had wheels, so they could take off from the runway and land on a glacier.
The plane has to have a large flat area to land, so the dog team was used just as a vehicle is today to connect to the village or the post office.
Dog teams played an important role in early aviation. They actually came to the rescue in a 1938 plane crash in McGrath.
This is the airplane that Carl Ben Eilson brought to Fairbanks in 1929.
In a flight from Fairbanks to McGrath, this Stearman plane made the first commercial flight to deliver mail.
It took 2 hours from Fairbanks to McGrath in this airplane, and the only thing besides that was a dog team, which took 2 weeks.
Innovation, though, can seem crude by today's standards.
Open cockpit. You see, they had to sit out in the open, and they flew in that thing at 40 below zero, so they must have wore a lot of clothes.
Could you fly a plane like this?
Yeah, I could.
Would you?
No. There's no instrumentation, there's no radios, there's nothing to keep track of.
Yet in 1932, it was the first plane to land on Mount McKinley, now called Denali.
It's a monstrosity, and a beast.
It's a beast?
Well, because it's only got one engine.
The Beast is a 1929 Keystone loaning amphibian, one of two known to exist today, brought to Alaska by the late Governor J. Hammond when he was a young pilot. That thing that's on the very, very top, that is very weird.
The engine?
Yeah.
That's the engine.
Siebert says the plane's design made it hard to steer on the water, and by the time he met Hammond, he had moved on to other planes, but left a big impression on a 14-year-old boy in Pilot Point.
His handsome, rugged looks, you know, he was a hell of a man. I had no idea about flying. And he was my hero and my idol, and at least part of the reason I decided to learn to fly.
And the other reason? Pilot Point may have been a good place to commercial fish, but
it turned out there's no girls my age. And I'm 17 by then, okay? And my hormones were raging.
With an airplane paid for by commercial fishing, it didn't take him long to find the right girl.
Jenny was from Chignik, 100 miles away. You know, I went down there and I found her. And Chignik had no air service.
So when Orrin was there, he would try to help.
If they were sick or hurt, they usually just died or recovered on their own, whatever. But since I was there, they needed help. I'd throw them in my plane and I'd take them up to Dillingham.
And soon, he found a calling.
I had no thought of going into business, but that was the first spark. And I got the idea that, well, maybe I can make some money doing this. Doing what I wanted to do anyway.
About the same time Pen Air got off the ground, he married Jenny, and they started on a family of 8.
This is a flying boat. It's a true amphibian.
He also fell in love with the Grumman Goose, originally built to fly Long Island businessmen around. But in Alaska, it became a workhorse for the fishing industry and ferried workers, freight, and mail. So how many hours do you think you spend in the pilot seat of one of these?
Oh, I probably got 15,000 hours.
But eventually, the state built runways in most communities.
And this plane is more expensive and inefficient to operate. So their day is gone.
But planes like this live on in Orrin Siebert's memories and in his new book, You Breathe, I Fly. In it, he says airplanes were a passport to adventure, to see walrus herds at Round Island or lakes formed in volcano craters.
You could land and look around and imagine that there had never been another human being there ever.
A feeling that motivated some of the early pilots like Russell Merrill in their struggles to get Alaska aviation off the ground.
I cannot imagine Alaska being anywhere near what it is without aviation.
You can find Orrin Siebert's book at the Alaska Aviation Museum. The proceeds go to help the museum, where you can find the answer to this next question about the very first flight in Alaska. Here's a look at the airplane. See the young couple beside it, James and Lily Martin. In fact, Lily was England's first female aviator. Well, they flew this plane in Alaska on July 4th, 1913. But where did that historic flight take place? A, Valdez, B, in Seward, C, Fairbanks, D, or in Anchorage? Well, we'll have our answer for you at the end of the show and a little more information about that first airplane flight in Alaska. But first, meet some Alaska aviation legends like Georgi Jorgensen, how he not only flew over mountains but transcended prejudice and discrimination against Alaska natives.
Welcome to our One for Everyone sales event.
We're looking for something reliable.
Every new Toyota comes with Toyota Care. It's our 2-year or 25,000-mile maintenance plan.
I can do my own maintenance.
Also includes 24-hour roadside assistance.
Oh, roadside, my own assistance. Thank you.
At no additional cost.
That's great.
Okay, yeah. Sign us up.
Get 0% APR for 72 months plus $1,000 bonus cash on Camry. Or get $2,500 customer cash on Camry during Toyota's One for Everyone sales event.
Now we can sell your tools.
Toyota, let's go places.
Today, the impossible is happening. Someone is coming home. Thanks to the Leukemia and Lymphoma Society, thousands with blood cancer are coming home to live a normal life. Many are in remission. Many have put cancer behind them. And you're helping to make this possible. When you support LLS, you not only advance the most pioneering cancer research of our time, you accelerate promising treatments that save lives. You make a difference. By sending more people home, we're turning someday into today. Join us.
We are providers. We are artists. We are many things, but drugs do not define us. It's a fact. 85% of Alaska Native and American Indian people don't use illegal drugs. For more resources on building a healthy life, visit anthc.org/weare.
The Alaska Aviation Hall of Fame now has 3 new members. They were celebrated at a banquet this weekend. Georgi Jorgensen said when he saw Noel Wien land a plane in 1932, he knew he wanted to be a pilot. So he joined the Territorial Guard in the 1940s, saved up his money for flying lessons, which cost $2.50 for 15 minutes of time. But it all paid off. He was one of the first Alaska Natives to earn a commercial pilot's license and one of the first to protest segregation at a movie theater in Nome. A local civil rights activist asked him to take his daughter to the movies and sit in an area reserved for whites. When the police came, he held his ground.
I was 17 years old, husky young man. And these 2 old guys, you could tell they'd smoked half their life when they were huffing and puffing and trying to break me loose, and 2 of them couldn't break me loose. So they went and got the chief. The chief comes in and he had one of these billy clubs, and he started whacking my knuckles where I was hanging onto the chair.
Jorgensen continued to fight racial discrimination as an aviator. He said that he always strived to be the best at whatever he tried. His skills as a bush pilot were legendary, and he later went on to fly all over the world, including Africa. Also inducted to the Hall of Fame, J. Vic Bud Brown, Jr. Brown helped to form the Civil Air Patrol in Anchorage, which became a lifeline during the 1964 earthquake.
I was out there flying people around and flying oxygen to hospitals and on the Kenai and Seward and Valdez.
The 3rd inductee is the late Sam White, the world's first flying game warden. When he pioneered the first aerial moose survey in the late 1920s, his boss told him to go out, get a dog team, and do a proper survey. Well, each year we get a sampling of all the amazing people who have made aviation history in Alaska through this Hall of Fame project. And joining us now, Gail Phillips and Rob Stapleton, who are dedicated museum volunteers, and their mission is to preserve Alaska's rich aviation history. So, Gail, maybe you might start off by telling us how the Hall of Fame got started. What's its history?
Well, just a little prehistory. In 1977, Ted Spencer started the Alaska Historical Aircraft Society and ran that society as a museum for a few years until 1988, when that morphed into the Alaska Aviation Museum. And the museum operated with a mission to preserve, display, educate, and honor Alaska's aviation heritage. So in order to fulfill the mission, in the year 2000, the board of directors at the museum decided they would begin the Alaska Aviation Museum Hall of Fame. And we started that in 2000 and has continued every year since. The problem is, when we started to put together the list of aviators to honor, we realized we would be at this for a couple hundred years. Because in those early years, we were only doing 1 honoree a year. So a couple years after, in 2011, we decided that we would honor 3 inductees every year. 1, the Explorer Pathway pilot. 1, the aviation entrepreneur that started aviation business. And the other, a Lifetime Achievement Award for those involved in aviation, but were not actually pilots or business people.
Well, Rob, you talked to a lot of these pilots and put together information to share with the community about them. What's your sense? Are we losing this link pretty quickly between those early aviation days?
Yes, we are, and I think that's we're at a critical point now where people that were, when we first started talking to them, were in their 80s or now in their 90s, like Georgie Jorgensen, for example. So I think it's, it's our mission to get everything that we can, information about aviators. That's A.A. Bennett.
Now, one of the things that people say is that if you follow aviation history, you also follow Alaska's history.
Absolutely. It was aviation that opened up Alaska, that opened up the different regions of Alaska and allowed for businesses, mining and fishing and timber. All of the economic and natural resource businesses in Alaska are a result of aviation coming into those communities.
Well, in these modern days, we think of oil and other things as part of our identity, the Iditarod.
Yes, and those things are.
How is aviation part of the Alaskan identity?
Had those areas of Alaska not been opened up with aviation in the early years, none of this, it would have been much more difficult to bring on everything.
Yeah,
after that.
It took quite a cast of characters. And Rob, I know because you talked to these folks and you've also written your own book about Alaska's bush pilots. You've got a collection of photos for us. So let's start with them and tell us a little about some of these photos and why you selected them for this program.
Sure, love to. Well, that's a McGee Airways Blanca covered with furs, and Mac McGee was a trapper and a fur buyer. And he made so much money, he was able to start an airline.
And one of the airlines that merged with Alaska Airlines.
Became Alaska Airlines, exactly.
So we also have a photo of someone from the Reeve family.
Bob Reeve, yeah, what a character. And, a real legend. He started the Aleutian Airways, and that ended up being probably the main airway that was used in the Aleutian Islands during World War II.
So we also have Joe Cross in here, a photograph, and he's got some diphtheria serum. Yeah,
that was a diphtheria serum run, and I kind of like that picture because, not just because of the fact that they were making a medical run, but look at the fur that they're wearing. That's the kind of clothing that the pilots had to wear in the early days.
Just to keep warm and make sure they made it to the next destination.
That's right.
So we also have another bush pilot photo. And why did you choose this one?
Well, it's a beautiful picture in its entirety. You can't really see the mountains at the other side of the lake, but the two airplanes that were probably used the most, the Cessna 180 on the left and the Grumman Goose, were very instrumental in helping Alaska in terms of getting fuel and people back and forth.
In other words, they were workhorses. Exactly. So what about this picture of Harold Gillum?
Thrill 'em, spill 'em, no kill 'em, Gillum. That was his nickname.
Oh, my goodness.
When he operated out of Cordova. But that picture was taken shortly before they went up searching for Carl Ben Eielson that was lost in Russia.
So it's got kind of a sad story behind it.
Right. But that's the airplane that's actually in the museum.
So what about this other photograph that we have? Why did you choose that one?
Well, Estill Call is the pilot that's standing by the airplane. I liked it because of the clothing, the fact that they're on the airplane's on the river and you can see the buildings. So it was on the Yukon River.
Yeah, the clothing, boy, that's a theme that comes up over and over. Now, of course, we can't not mention Don Sheldon.
Don Sheldon, yep, the great glacier pilot. He actually perfected glacier landing, which Bob Reeve had started over in the Valdez area on different mines and different glaciers.
And we also have one more picture of the Reeves, Bob and Dick Reeve.
Yeah, it's Bob and Dick Reeve at Merrill Field in its early days. You can see a Fairchild, looks like a 51 in the background, and then the Boeing 80.
Family businesses back then. Now, we also have one more photo of Georgie Jorgensen.
Right. Georgie is at the controls of a Lockheed Hercules, which he flew all over the world. So, you don't take Georgie's stories lightly because he's got plenty of them and they're real.
And you know, it's interesting that he is now blind, and I guess his loss of his eyesight led to him ending his career earlier than he wanted to.
That's true. There's a picture of him with Al Wright of Wright Air fame. Georgie was probably one of the best instrument pilots that Alaska has ever seen, utilizing the older aircraft and older instruments, and he's been a real proponent of IFR instrument flying.
Now, one of the things that Georgie and Orrin Siebert, as well as Bud, he talked about how they just love the way these pilots look, that when they were kids, they were so fascinated and they wanted to be like them.
Yeah, Georgie said that when Noel Wien got out of the plane, he saw those boots, and that's what really attracted him. those high knee boots. So,
well,
yeah.
What is it about pilots that even today?
Well, you know, it's for so much of Alaska, in rural Alaska, aviation is a major link to those communities. So when young kids can go run out to the airport, either on a snow machine or four-wheeler, meet the airplane, talk to the pilot, you know, there is some excitement and romance in that.
Now, tell us a little bit about how you got interested in aviation. Well,
I grew up in Nome, so in the wintertime, if the weather was bad, we were totally isolated, no roads. The winter freezes in the winter, the ocean freezes in the winter. So aviation was a major link to the outside world.
But you had an inside scoop on this.
I did, and luckily I was very fortunate when I was in high school to be able to go to work for the airlines. I worked for both Wien Airlines and Alaska Airlines in Nome.
So what are your favorite memories from those times?
Well, one I was talking about earlier was I was working in the ticket counter, downtown ticket counter for Wien, and the downtown ticket counter was right on the main street, and the upstairs for the ticket counter was the pilot's quarters. And one of my early jobs was to have to go up and bang on the door and wake up those pilots, Georgie included, to get ready to go on their flights to the island, St. Lawrence Island.
One thing we didn't talk about earlier when we visited the museum was just how dangerous this flying was, and that the museum is full of a lot of wrecked airplanes.
Well, it was, you know, those exploration days when the pilots started out and with very limited maps and no GPS and no radio communications, no fuel stations along the way. You know, there was they were intrepid people, I think, to develop the air routes in Alaska that they did.
Well, it's interesting, though, that people are fascinated with, you know, some mushed up engine from a crash. Why does the museum include these?
Well, some of those engines are no longer available. And then they also have the history behind what airplane they were on and who was flying it. So it's just as important as the people.
Like one of the burnt out hulks in the museum is an aircraft called a Seattle. It was it was an aircraft that was built for the first round the world trip by air, and it crashed in.
It sunk.
Sunk in Alaska. So we have that in the museum. That's an incredible piece of history.
And there are other things in the museum that people probably have no idea about. A dirigible that landed in Barrow. And
you know, aviation is such a major part of Alaska's development and our infrastructure and everything. So we always try to get people to come out and see their history of Alaska through the eyes of the museum.
And it is quite a place. You can't take it in on one visit.
No.
So.
Fly an hour or walk a week.
That's an interesting motto. So true. Well, thank you very much, Rob Stapleton and Gail Phillips. Well, coming up, the answer to our Frontiers trivia question, 1913, the year that opened Alaska's eyes to aviation's potential. But in what city did that first flight take place?
I just want cremation.
Cremation specialist in Alaska.
Can I have a service before cremation?
Our staff is committed to serving your needs.
I just want something basic. The simpler, the better.
Specializing in simple cremations. Whatever your reasons are for choosing cremation, call Cremation Society of Alaska, 277-2777, or in the Valley, 373-8 8627 and on the web at alaskacremation.com.
Somewhere in Alaska's wild, Ali Zirkle is leading the way toward ending domestic violence affecting Alaska's kids.
These kids are heroes. They're trying to improve themselves so they can go back and improve their communities.
Today, Ali and Lead On are helping to make that possible. Help end domestic violence, spread respect, build friendships, and strengthen communities. Visit andvsa.org.
Everyone can make a difference.
Hey, Kids Day in Anchorage's Promise Partner event is Saturday, April 15th from 10 to 4. Grab your parents and go to the Denina Center for a day of family fun. And it's free. There's stuff for kids of all ages. Wild About Reading with free books, a street fair with bouncy house, and even the Easter Bunny. Kids Day features over 80 youth organizations. And this year, a lucky family in need will receive a car. Visit anchoragespromise.org for more information. Kids Day in Teen City. I'll see you there. Brought to you by these sponsors.
What is health? It's more than a number on the scale. It's in the water we drink and the air we breathe. It's reflected in our jobs, our climate, and our community. Our health is holistic. Our health care should be the same. At ANTHC, we're providing clean water and sanitation around the state. We're working in partnership to make homes safer, healthcare treatment smarter, and fulfill our vision that Alaska Native people are the healthiest people in the world.
Now the answer to our Frontiers trivia question. Where did the first flight in Alaska occur? Well, it happened in 1913, 10 years after Orville and Wilbur Wright's historic flight near Kitty Hawk, North Carolina. So where did Alaska's inaugural flight take place? Valdez, B, Seward, C, Fairbanks, D, Anchorage. At the Aviation Museum, you can find the story of how James Martin and his wife Lily flew the airplane over the town of Fairbanks on Independence Day. They used an ocean steamer to get the plane to Skagway, and from there it traveled on a steamboat to Fairbanks. The crowd gathered at a ball field in Fairbanks and had to pay to watch. The Martins had hoped to sell their plane to finance a flight across the Atlantic, but there were no takers, so they had to ship it back to their home in San Francisco. So many interesting stories like this one, and we haven't told you all the stories about that one. But in the show, we have shared a few with you, and there are so many more to tell you about. Hope you enjoyed them. Thanks for joining us. We'll see you next week.